It's interesting because as I started growing with this project, and we had a couple meetings, and again, it was just me trying to understand what the heck was going on with this project. And one of the questions I asked was, well, what was life in forestry like before glyphosate? Like, what?
That's a good question.
What were you guys doing? And these are old guys, right, that have been around a long time, and they said basically we were not sustainable. We could not guarantee that when we harvested a stand that we could put it back to where it was, because we didn't have the tools to. And this is not extensive. This is not like everywhere in Alberta, but there's a big chunk of Alberta where they were not sustainable. And they basically felt that they didn't have the tools at hand to be able to ensure that.
Hey guys, welcome to Your Forest. My name is Matthew Kristoff, and on this podcast, we talk about the environment and the science of sustainability. Today's episode was a really exciting one for me, mostly because this stuff is contentious and this stuff is hard to navigate, and I like a challenge, and it was a fun conversation. This conversation is one that I'm always cautious to talk about, as the same as with like social issues and that kind of thing, because this issue is one that really gets to the heart of a lot of people's problems with forest management and that kind of thing. And that is the use of glyphosate on forest landscapes. And so I wanted to bring on some people that could really discuss the ecological impact of glyphosate on the forest landscape and on the biodiversity, the ecological health of that area that it's been sprayed, right? And so I thought there's a lot of information about the effects of glyphosate kind of the few years, 10 to 15 years after it's been sprayed and what that does. And the truth is that it's pretty drastic because it's supposed to be. But I wanted to know the long-term impacts, the long-term effects, because ultimately the forest is a long-term thing. And it takes, you know what I mean? If it takes 120 years for a stand to become mature and go through its full life cycle, then we need to know at least half of that, what the biodiversity is like. So anyways, I brought on some people. I was lucky enough to be involved in a study that was talking about exactly that, talking about the long-term impacts on biodiversity of glyphosate. Right. So it was a really cool study and actually only 3 studies like it that exist, it being one of them. So there's really only 2 others. The first one was about 20 years ago from Lautenschlager and Sullivan. The second one was called the Austin Pond Study. And the third one is the new one that's just coming out now. It's not even published yet, but we get to talk to people about it, learn what they learn, pick their brain. It was really, really a cool opportunity. So the 2 people we're going to speak to about this, one, his name is Matt Olson. He is an assistant professor of environmental sciences at Stockton University, and he is an ecologist that was involved in the Austin Pond study about 11 years ago. And then also, the other person we get to speak to is John Nash, who is a coworker of mine. He's an ecologist. He happened to be the ecologist on this new study. And so I was involved with some of the field data collection and that kind of stuff, and just kind of happenstance. And so that triggered this idea of bringing these people on to have this conversation, because I think people really want to know, what is the impact of glyphosate long-term on biodiversity? So I think it's important to get out there and, to be honest, to spill the beans a little bit. According to them, in the studies that they did, the answer is that there really was no long-term impact. So we detail it in the podcast. So if you want to know more, it's all there, and you can look up the papers themselves and dig deep and be skeptical. I support that. That's what we want. Ultimately, this question of is it okay to use glyphosate, and it's along the same lines of is it sustainable? Are we doing sustainable forest management? And that's ultimately what we want. We want the forest to be sustainable for all values forever. That means we want to be able to forage and eat off the landscape. We want to be able to drink the water. We want animals to be safe and healthy. And we want the forest to be of a composition that supports all of those things, right? So it was a really cool conversation, and I could not be more thankful to be privileged enough to have it with these 2 gentlemen. They were really good, really honest and open about their opinions and their preconceived notions and how that changed over the course of the study. So before we jump into it, I do want to provide a little context about the use of herbicides in forestry, just for people who may not know. So the use of chemical herbicides in reforestation is a really contentious issue, as you can imagine. In particular, the use of glyphosate, which is the main one used, as far as I know, in Canada, has come under really intense scrutiny due to some recent class action lawsuits in the US. I happened to talk to Dr. Ryan Prosser in episode 60 of the podcast about the toxicology of glyphosate. So if you want to know about that, how it impacts the soils directly and the toxicity of it, definitely check out episode 60, because we're not going to talk about it here. This is about ecology and biodiversity, not toxicology. So episode 60 for that was an awesome conversation as well. In this podcast, we explore the long-term effects of glyphosate on biodiversity in the forest. Like I said, herbicides are used to change the dominance of plant species during reforestation. So, for example, in Alberta, there's a grass called blue joint reedgrass, or Calamagrostis canadensis, and it frequently dominates the plant community on moist to wet clay soils, and that really limits the establishment and growth of a lot of other plant species. So, glyphosate is often used to shift that dominance. The glyphosate is used to help conifer species come back, right? That situation where the grass takes over after a disturbance is not one that you specifically see after natural disturbance. It's one that's pretty unique to forest harvest for the most part. And because of that, we run into unique problems. And that one main problem is that if you cut a conifer stand, you want to have a conifer stand come back. And if the reed grass prevents you from doing that, then you have to do something about it, because we're trying to emulate natural as much as possible. So that's kind of why glyphosate is used. It's a unique situation that requires a unique solution. Anyways, with this conversation, the whole point is we want to know that glyphosate ultimately is safe to use and ethical to use. That's what we want to know. Because myself as a forester, I want forests to be sustainable forever, and I want to know the answer. Is it okay to use glyphosate? Because it's one of those things that you hear the word glyphosate or herbicide and you kind of cringe a little bit. You're like, I don't know, we don't need to do that. What about nature-based solutions and that kind of thing? And I thought this was a really interesting take on it, was diving into the ecology, the biodiversity. It paints a different picture than one we might think. So I really appreciated both Matthew and John's contribution to this conversation. Like I said, they're both ecologists, and that's the route we went. Really enjoyed it, and I think it paints a good picture of at least this segment of it. I'm not saying this is the full picture. This is just ecology, biodiversity. If you want to talk about toxicology or indigenous use or any of the other things that you might be concerned about, that's different. So, but this is just one segment of it, one argument, right? So yeah, I was really excited to have this conversation. I hope you guys enjoy it. I really, really, really enjoyed it, and I learned a bunch. And yeah. Sponsors for 2021, West Fraser is the number one sponsor, and I could not be more thankful for their support. They really helped me do this the way I want to do it, and I just could not be more appreciative. Thank you, West Fraser. Greenlink Forestry is also a sponsor of the podcast, and without them, this would not be possible. Thank you, Greenlink, for all your support. Damaged Timber is the final sponsor. They are selling all kinds of stuff. They started out as clothes, and they give 10% of everything they sell to a environmental sciences scholarship. But now they're selling stuff that you can put in your kitchen. So they're going out into the bush, cutting down wildfire burnt trees and turning it into something you can put in your kitchen, like a butcher block and that kind of thing. Hence the Damaged Timber, right? It's a really cool idea. Go to damagedtimber.com, put in your forest 10 at checkout. Yeah, check them out. Really cool. Without any further messing around, let's dive into this conversation all about the use of glyphosate on the forestry land base and the effects of it on biodiversity long term. Here we go. So I usually start these things by talking about like getting to know the people a little bit, which is interesting because John and I work together, but we don't like, you know what I mean? I've never heard his story, so I'll get to hear it today. So what motivated you to go down this career path of, environmental sciences, and why do you still do it? Why do you continue to do it? Why is it worthwhile to you?
Yeah. Those are great questions. I guess maybe I'll just start off by just stating, my name is Matt Olson. I'm an assistant professor at Stockton University. I'm in the environmental sciences program. I'm the one who's been tasked with teaching the forestry classes, and I also get involved with some of the management on the university property and stuff like that. This is a question we often throw to students. We ask them, so why environmental studies? Why forestry? Why, what got your foot in the door, so to say. And I would say my story is very similar to what a lot of the students say. It's, I grew up like hunting, fishing, camping, hiking, just basically spending lots of time in the woods. And so for me, the woods has always been like a very welcoming, very like a recreational space for me. So I've spent a lot of time in the woods. And it wasn't until a little bit later that I realized that I could actually make a living studying forests and spending significant time in forests. And so it was right at that point that once I realized that, I was like, yeah, it was kind of a no-brainer for me. So that's really what got me kind of going in that direction of environmental studies, environmental sciences, forestry, and stuff like that. Why I decided to dedicate my life to it really is that I just care about forests and trees so much, really, was what it comes down to. I just, when I'm not doing stuff with my family, I'm often spending time in the woods. So, and in any way that I can contribute to ensuring that forests continue to persist and that they're healthy and that they also provide opportunities for others to recreate, I want to be a part of that.
But the reason I like to ask people this question is just because you're professionals. Some people might listen to it as like, oh, they'll come at it from a professional lens, but try to humanize you a little bit, right? Try and make it more relatable, I suppose. So why do you keep doing it?
On the research end of things, I'm just so fascinated by the forest. And so for me, it's just as much a creative outlet as it is a career path, so just spending time that's kind of a double dip. I get to do my work and get paid for it in the woods, yet I also get to spend time in the woods, which is like the place I want to be. And then also kind of on the teaching side of things, I love to talk about forests, and I love to get students interested in forests and engaged in forestry topics and forest ecology and stuff like that. So those are my main motivations, is really just to kind of promote the wise use of our forests and just general understanding of our forests and our forest resources and kind of where we fit in to the big picture.
Absolutely. I like that. Yeah. The human relationship with it. So yeah. Great. John, what's your story?
Well, kind of similar, but a different path, I guess. My dad was he was a geologist, a hard rock geologist. And so I followed in his footsteps for about 15 years and really enjoyed it. But I also enjoyed the forest that we were in. So I spent a lot of time in northern Ontario and northern Manitoba. And all of the natural stuff. I was always interested in nature. And ended up having a family, and the job of a exploration geologist was not very conducive to a family. You're gone all summer. You don't see anybody for weeks on end.
Yeah.
And I decided to do a career path change. So I had about 3 years of geology at university before I changed over. Ended up getting a BA in environmental studies out of it.
That'll work.
and then switched over to biology. And I got really my first interest in biology though was evolution. So but then once I started taking the ecology courses, I started really getting interested in that. And my BSc has got a real strong slant in forest ecology. I was under the tutelage there of a guy named Jeff Wang. You might have heard of him. Matt?
Oh yeah.
I'm not sure. Yeah. So he was my mentor for 3 years, and mathematically, statistically, he taught me so much. And
that's the hard stuff to learn too.
Yeah, exactly. And
it's not obvious why it's important.
And so, yeah, so I really got an interest in it. And then when I graduated, I did a summer position at Louisiana Pacific in Swan River, Manitoba. And went on unemployment for about 5 months and then got a job out here. And this was in 1999 and never looked back since.
So why is it worthwhile to you? Why do you still do this work?
So the biggest thing I like about ecology by far is the multidisciplinary aspect of it. Like we're not just like when people look at ecology, you're not just talking about one thing. You're talking about a bunch of different disciplines coming in. And I've always considered myself a jack of all trades and master of none. So, I mean, I have pretty good soil background. I have a pretty good vegetation background. I got a pretty good stats background. I got a pretty good climate background. But I am not an expert in any one of those things. Like, there's always somebody who's better than I am. What I'm most interested in is how all this stuff really comes together in sort of a community, and what makes up the community and why all these things are there.
I like that. Yeah. I think like I grew up, both my parents are foresters. And so that's kind of the route I ended up going, just because it seemed like a good way to get into environmental studies and that kind of stuff, and it made sense, and I love it. But also, when I really think about what I like, it's what you just said. It's the like how all of these puzzle pieces fit together to build a healthy ecosystem kind of thing.
And then the job itself for me is just wonderful. I mean, I've done everything from building ecosite field guides to modeling wood profiles using just LiDAR and AVI data at a landscape level. And it's just been wonderful. Like every day, like I've got about 6 different projects going at once, and not any of them are exactly the same, or some of them aren't even close to the same.
yeah, for sure. Yeah. So I just like to get that context for going into these conversations, because we're going to get into a conversation about that is a pretty contentious one, right? Talking about the use of herbicide glyphosate and on forestry landscape and biodiversity and that kind of stuff. And I wanted to get that context in for like explaining your guys' motivation as well as my own, right? For getting into this field and what you hope to take away from your career and that kind of thing. So I wanted to ask a couple more kind of more meta questions before we dive into the glyphosate biodiversity thing. Like as ecologists, and Matt, we'll start with you again. What is forest management to you? Like, what role does forest management have in stewarding ecology, like balancing the landscape, that kind of thing?
Yeah. Yeah, I like to start off just thinking in terms of like kind of our interaction with the forest, right? You know, we spend time in the woods, we recreate, but we also have a dependence on wood products. And that's not something that's going to change anytime soon. At least I don't think we've come up with a product to really replace wood entirely just yet. So it's one of those where I just know that, you know, like we're going to need to be able to derive basically timber for wood products and stuff like that from our forests and from our woodlands. So therefore, to be able to do so in a way that doesn't undercut our ability to kind of meet present day needs, but also future needs for future generations, we have to practice sound ecologically based management in our forests and woodlands to ensure that there is a resource not only for present generations, but also for future generations. And so that's to me, as an ecologist, more of an applied ecologist, that's kind of where I see forest management in general. So I feel like we've also gotten to a point as a species, humans that is, that we've grown to the point now, our population, that we are having effects on the forest, even when we don't think we're having effects on the forest. So we have fundamentally changed the game in a lot of ways. So I think it's really on us to kind of assist nature as much as we can to ensure that our forest ecosystems, and all ecosystems for that matter, not just forests, that they're healthy, that they function in a way, that they provide all the life support services that they do, not just for us, not just for our benefit, but for other species as well.
Yeah, John, what's your thought? Where do you see forest management in the scheme of things, in the balance of the equation like we were just talking about?
Yeah, just to expand on what Matt said, and maybe just put it into a sort of a boreal context. Here in the boreal, it's a very fire-driven system, and we do fire management. And so we have to integrate that into everything that we do in the forest management. I mean, if we're going to suppress fires, we're going to have to do something with the trees at some point. So I think the way that Alberta does it is that they integrate that into their harvesting. And I think that's an important aspect of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, like the way, just kind of to summarize, like the way I always viewed it and always see it, and it's just a simplification of what you guys just said basically, but is that we can only do forestry if it is sustainable, period. Like if it's not sustainable in the long term, if we couldn't if the math doesn't work out in a way in which we could continue to do this forever, then I don't see an ethical way in which we can continue to do it. Right. Regardless of economic or whatever else, like you lose too much over the long term if it's not sustainable. And that's what I love about forestry is that they're only cutting the interest. They're never cutting into the principal, right? You're only cutting the growth, the annual growth. So there's not supposed to be ever a dip into the interest, right? Or into the principal. So that's what I like about it is that, and that's the vibe I get from all forest management people and ecologists and that kind of thing is that everyone's on board with it, right? As long as we continue to do it the way we've been doing it, which is just doing it sustainably. So we can continue to do this forever and we don't have to worry about something disappearing because we cut it all or whatever, right? So
yeah, that's right. And I think we have to take it in, we have to be considerate of the fact that there's other industrial pressures on the forest and there's recreational pressures on the forest. And we have to respect those.
Yeah. And forest management, and I think that's the challenge of forest management is in today, right? Is that it tries to include all of the values the forest contains, but forest management isn't necessarily like they don't have all those answers, right?
That's right.
They're good at managing trees and we're good at protecting and kind of keeping away from things that we're supposed to keep away from. And we're kind of, but it's a huge challenge and requires it requires ecologists and biologists and it requires conservationists and it requires the recreationists and everybody to do it properly. And that's what's exciting about it is that we have somehow managed to figure out a way to balance this equation to like both work, live, and allow the forest to exist, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the pressure is on the forest companies themselves to be the ones who manage that. And so they have to be, I don't think the recreational groups and, if I can call them that, and other industries are looking at it at that broad of a scale. They're not necessarily required to, I don't think, but I think there's always been a lot of pressure on forest companies that yes, they have to.
Yeah, the 200-year time horizon is like I can't think of any other. Maybe peat farms.
Yeah,
maybe them, but that would be it, right? Like I can't imagine anybody else that's thinking of that time horizon. So going into this conversation, like I assume as ecologists, like as students, kind of thing, when you first came across the use of like herbicide or glyphosate in forestry and that kind of thing, what were your how did you guys feel about that? As ecologists, what were your preconceived notions that you had?
Yeah. This is an interesting question because it really got me thinking. Because I've been doing this long enough now. We're just like, wait, well, at this time point, I was accepting of it. At this a little further back, not quite as accepting, that kind of thing. And of course, as I've learned more about it, it's changed my perception of it.
Well, I think everybody goes through that.
Yeah. Yeah, this kind of this discovery.
Yeah, you start at a place of like herbicide, bad.
Right.
And then you have to dive into it, and it's not that simple.
Yeah, really my preconceived notion, so growing up in New Jersey, the most densely populated state in the United States, and I think the next census will probably bear that out again. So my perception of it was like, herbicide applications, pesticide applications, mainly on people's yards, maybe in parks, open area kind of parks, green space kind of parks, that kind of thing. Maybe in agriculture, more like typical traditional row crop agriculture and farmland and stuff. And that was my view of where herbicides, that's where they're applied, not so much in the woods. And so it wasn't until I got into forestry school was that basically opened up to me, that whole world of herbicide application and vegetation management and stuff like that. My first reaction to that, was pretty standoffish, I guess. I was a little concerned when I started hearing things about that. Some of that has to do with my academic upbringing as well. So I was at the University of Maine, and that's where I got one of my undergraduate degrees. And it was at the University of Maine that we really started first talking about herbicide technology and stuff. And, so I don't want to I'm not going to name names or anything like that, but the focus there at the time was a little bit more on ecological forestry and using more, mechanical approaches to managing structure and composition, stuff like that in forests. We talked about the importance of herbicides, but we didn't really go into too much detail on it. But it wasn't until I want to say it was my silviculture class, and not too surprising, my undergraduate silviculture class, that my future advisor, a basically went back to the University of Maine to get my PhD. But as an undergrad, he wound up coming in and giving a guest lecture. And this is Dr. Bob Wagner, who worked in Canada for many years and stuff, Robert Wagner. And he
had him on the podcast last year.
Oh, cool.
Talking about a lot of stuff like this. Yeah.
Yeah.
So if people want to listen to that, it's along the same lines. We talk about values and forestry and all that kind of stuff. And it was a great conversation. So yeah, he's a great mind for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. And to have him kind of introduce the concept of applications of herbicides and other vegetation management approaches in forests. I mean, that really kind of opened up everything for me, because it's like seeing it from somebody from his perspective, where he's looked at all sides of it, and he's compared the herbicide technology against alternatives and everything else, and did so in a rigorous experimental framework. The fact that he can kind of explain the pros and the cons of everything very, very well to us, that really opened up my mind to it. So in a lot of ways, that destroyed those preconceived notions that herbicides are only applied in yards and on farmland.
Right. So, and John, how about you? Like, how did your
pretty much similar to Matt, but even when I got into forestry, I knew they were using it, but other than that, I really had no real information or knowledge about any of the issues, to be honest with you, and because I was just so on another side of forestry. It wasn't silviculture based or anything like that. So I knew it was being used, but I didn't know there was contention and anything like that. And I was completely ignorant about the whole thing.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. It wasn't until Milo asked me to be part of this project, this study, that I started learning quite a bit about it then.
Also, literally through this study that you started to get your education around. That's cool.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Very cool. Very cool. Okay. I guess what was your guys' interest in getting involved in this study before we get into that? What was your interest in getting involved in these studies first? Money. John says money. That makes sense. We're all monetarily motivated at some point. He's sitting here rubbing his thumb together. But yeah, like why? Because this is the reason I asked that question, first of all, is because this is so contentious, and there's a lot of loud voices on you know what I mean, opposed to the use of glyphosate. So why would you guys want to stick your neck out there and be involved in something like this? Matt?
Yeah. So, kind of much like John's response there. For me, it was very monetarily driven. My decision to get into this in the first place.
That's not what you're supposed to say. I know, it's supposed to be an enlightened answer.
Well, it was tied to what really got me going on the Austin Pond study. Was I was a postdoc. This was after I finished up my PhD at the University of Maine. I had an opportunity to stay on for a couple more years, working on a postdoc. And at that time, we just didn't really have a project identified as something to work on. There were like several options available to me. And my supervisor in this case was Robert Wagner once again. And so Bob just basically presented to me, he's like, here's some opportunities, some directions you can go in with a project. You can apply the money that way. And one of those was the Austin Pond study. And he really sold me on it. For a couple things. In my PhD work, I started working with long-term data sets from old silviculture studies and basically collecting some new data to kind of append to the long-term data to be able to tell kind of the longer story of forest management actions, which, as you know, we kind of need those longer timeframes to really evaluate long-term consequences and stuff in the woods. And so, so that really got me interested in working with these long-term, these like kind of old data sets. Well, the Austin Pond study was just like a great example of that. So I kind of saw it as an opportunity to grab onto a project that already had some history, had some data with it. And to be quite honest, I was also interested in the effects of the herbicides, the long-term effects too. But then also there was also pre-commercial thinning out there, and it was just a really beautiful spot. Those are kinds of things that really got me initially going on the Austin Pond study. I guess really to contribute to that long-term project. There was also basically the Austin Pond study basically has taken on a new life. So there's been some new experimentation out there too. And I was a part of some of those discussions, like what treatments were going to be applied and all that kind of thing, kind of overlaying a new experimental design on top of the old experiment. So that was very exciting to be a part of too.
Awesome. Very cool. Yeah. It was an interesting, I didn't expect the pre-commercial thinning stuff in there. It was an interesting comparison. So if people wanted to check that out, they can read up on how that compares. It's cool.
Yeah.
So John, I guess we're here because the study that you guys just did, like it hasn't even been published yet, right? Like you got everything together.
I think it's still in draft. Yeah,
still in draft, and so you're finalizing it. It's coming out, but there is information out for people to see. And one of the coolest things I like about this is that you guys created this field tour guide. So there's literally a book that's available to the public, I think right now, to see, and they can read the highlights, and it has a map and directions of how to get to these sites, so you can go see for yourself and compare for yourself, just if you're interested, right? And I'll post the links for all of that in the show notes for people that want to see it. So let's talk about so what is long term? We're talking about the long term effects of glyphosate on, and for your guys' purpose, my understanding is this is all about biodiversity. This has nothing to do with wood fiber production. This has nothing to do with forestry per se, as far as, you know what I mean, the timber value. This is about ecology. This is about biodiversity. This is about the health of the landscape and the impacts that glyphosate had versus a control in that area. Correct? Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. So, John, I'll start with you, because this is why we're here, is because this study is coming out. It's kind of confirming some things that the last two studies, like the Austin Pond and the Lautenschlager-Sullivan one, kind of were talking about. So let's just kind of break it down for me. What did you guys do? What is this study exactly?
So what we did was we piggybacked on an earlier study that was done in the early 2000s, I believe. And so there was some plots established looking at sort of similar things, but it was more of a tree focus on that, was just looking at the impacts of herbicide on the actual trees, I believe. And then this one, 15, 20 years later, the focus was really on biodiversity. So what in the understory, what are the changes in the understory that could be happening with or without the use of herbicides?
So the low level vegetation, the stuff on the ground.
That's right. Yes. So you're looking at your forbs and your shrubs and that kind of things. And it's not. We did collect tree information, of course, but that was not the focus of this study. That's the focus of another study.
Biodiversity was the main thing that was measured, right? That was the idea going into this, was biodiversity.
That's correct. So we put in one large plot, and then within that large plot we had 4 subplots orientated on the north, south, east, west axis, and then we collected basically lower vegetation, I guess, if you want to call it that, right, information from it.
And so I want to talk about biodiversity a little bit, just to kind of break down why it's important, right? So when it comes to ecology and like ecological health and that kind of thing, is biodiversity, would you say it's like the single best determinant for measuring health, or is there something else that should be measured?
Yeah, I think that's a complex question that doesn't have one single answer.
Okay.
I think biodiversity, you have to look at it sort of at different scales, spatial scales.
Okay.
Particularly. So, I mean, you could go into an old growth white spruce forest, and within that forest, you might just have feather moss and maybe a couple other little species. So within that site, there's no biodiversity, and these are natural stands, of course. But then you have to look at sort of biodiversity at a landscape level. So what's the role of this old growth spruce forest over the whole broader landscape?
Makes sense.
So within the context of herbicides, however, we were more looking at biodiversity as we were trying to ask the question specifically, did herbicide use affect the site in any way over the long term?
Yes.
So was there an impact on the site? And when we say site, we're talking about the soil properties.
Right.
So soil moisture, nutrients, that kind of stuff, all that stuff that's very important to plants. That was really just the focus, not sort of at the broader landscape scale. Although when we talk about biodiversity, that's something that should be talked about as well.
Right. Yeah, I guess what I was getting at was more just, like when you're trying to figure out if something is having an impact, is biodiversity a good way to go about it, kind of thing, right? That seems to be, it's the big word that everyone talks about, is biodiversity and species richness and stuff like that. And so that's a good measurement of how things are doing.
That's right. And we used several biodiversity indicators, but we also brought in another one. So we focused on certain floral species that we knew were specific to certain edaphic conditions in the soil. Okay. So typically these cut blocks are all sampled. There's micro variability in the soil, but in a general sense, the soil is pretty much the same across the whole harvesting regime. Mm-hmm. So one of the questions we were interested in is, okay, so these indicators, and we use these indicators in ecology all the time because it gives us a quick reference of what's going on below the ground.
Gotcha.
And was there any negative impact on those? Because if we had a natural indicator, or an indicator species in the natural part which didn't have herbicide, we would expect to see it in the herbicide side. Right.
So literally just comparing, there was a non-herbicided area, a herbicided area, and you're comparing them.
That's right. Yeah. And to expand on that, we did biodiversity measures, of course, from the data that we collected, but we also added a couple other ones too. And we also just looked at the simple total percent cover of certain species.
Right. So you're literally just trying to get a snapshot in time of what was the total impact that the use of glyphosate had on this area compared to the area that the same thing was done to, except for the use of glyphosate.
That's right. So if in this study, and if say one site we had 5 good indicator flora species in the natural zone, and if they weren't in the herbicided area, then that would start. We would start asking more questions. Well, okay, so why is that? If there was a clear indication that these were just localized in the unherbicided area, then we would be sitting there, okay, something potentially might be going on here that we're not aware of.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So how did the Austin Pond study compare to that? Like, what were you guys, what was your intention? What were you trying to figure out exactly? Something similar?
So very similar to what John was saying. I'm happy John kind of brought up the issue of scale and all that kind of stuff, and also how biodiversity, we can't necessarily think of it as like high biodiversity means good, low biodiversity means bad. It really just depends on ecological context and all that. For us, it was kind of twofold. Like one was that, for my postdoc project, I was going to go out and I was going to sample the tree. My main focus was on the tree component, the tree community component. And that's the story I really wanted to tell.
I see. Okay.
But it was also brought to my attention that a master student that worked 10 years before me, his first name is escaping me, but his last name is Daggett. And so he wound up doing some detailed measurements of ground flora back at that time. It had been I think it was almost exactly 10 years before I started the project. And so what we decided was like, well, if he did that and he did get really high quality floristic inventory information, then why don't we repeat that? That way we can actually say what's happened over the last 10 years with respect to the ground flora. Are we seeing any changes kind of over in the mid-rotation period, but over a 10-year period that we would describe as mid-rotation? And so that's kind of what got us going looking at that. My wife is actually a botanist, so we've her name is on the publication as well. And so we brought her into the fold because of her knowledge of plants and everything else. And that's really what kind of took it to the next level. I think that's when we really started seeing how we could use biodiversity as a way to evaluate some of the longer term consequences, not just for the tree community, but what's happening in the ground flora. And then by way of that, we could maybe even make some inferences about, say, impacts on soils or some other physical site factors, as John was describing.
Okay. So ultimately, for you guys, like as ecologists, you want to know what's going on with the soil, how the soil is impacted, and you're using the plant biomass as like an indicator for that. Just because it's probably a lot cheaper to study that than it is to do a bunch of soil pits and do chemistry on everything.
That's correct.
Okay. So do you feel that that's it's a good indicator for that? Like to try and understand the impact of something like glyphosate, like going over and doing this kind of stuff? Do you feel that it's enough?
I think going back to our study, I think if we found like a huge significant difference in biodiversity and indicator species, and that might have prompted a more detailed study on the actual soil properties themselves to try and figure out, okay, what the heck is going on here? Why is this so different?
Right. Yeah. So ultimately, let's talk about the results a little bit there, and then we'll get more in detail about like why that matters and talk about all that kind of stuff soon here. What did you guys conclude at the end of all this research? John, start with you.
Pretty much there was no significant differences between the treated and the herbicide application area and the area that didn't have herbicide application. There was some subtle differences on site-to-site comparisons, but overall, there was nothing that we saw that, and we were going in thinking that we would. Right. The only thing that we did do, and this was not part of the original intention, because Matt, you collected some of the field data as well. And so did I. I was out there as well. I noticed that in the treated areas, there was definitely a lot more feather moss than in the undertreated area.
In the treated areas. Yeah.
In the treated areas.
So the areas that were glyphosated or whatever.
That's correct. That had glyphosate. Yeah. There was a significant proportion of feather moss, but that was just an observation. So, moss isn't an indicator species by any stretch.
It's not.
But it's not. No. Okay. So it was never part of the indicator species analysis, but we thought we would throw it in because it was just an observation that we saw, and we wanted to see what the actual differences were.
Opportunity for another study, maybe, right?
No, not necessarily an opportunity. We just thought, well, we should include this because it was a noticeable difference in the field, so we shouldn't ignore it.
Oh, that's right. That was my point. Like, maybe if you note it, then maybe someone else will pick it up on that and check it out in more detail.
That's right. And I think, talking with the, with more of the academics and stuff like that, that's kind of a natural progression for going from, deciduous to conifer, is that it does favor the feather moss. It does, it's a sunlight thing.
Right. So I guess I'll explain. So like when the idea is that a glyphosated area, the idea is that there's not going to be, the glyphosate is going to temporarily get rid of the aspen competition as well as the grass competition to allow conifers to grow back. So the area that was applied with glyphosate would be a conifer dominated stand, whereas the area that was not applied glyphosate to is going to be mostly aspen dominated. So you're saying that although you notice that difference of the feather mosses, that you suspect it's just because the overstory species is different and that changes the...
Yeah, and that's correct. But the interesting part about that is that didn't affect any of the rest of the flora.
Yeah, that is interesting, yeah. Because, very interesting. So how did yours compare? What did you guys find in the end, Matt?
Yeah. So, to kind of tell the story, the Austin Pond study is that kind of, as you mentioned before, is often we see... And what we want really is kind of the immediate effect of the herbicide, reducing leaf area of competition and really just shifting composition to our desired species. And that certainly was the case with Austin Pond. And we saw a lot of variation depending on the type of formulation that was used and the application rate and all that kind of stuff. But for the most part, areas that were sprayed on Austin Pond push composition to conifer dominance, in some cases pretty strongly. Glyphosate, for example, was tested out there. Glyphosate was very effective in pushing composition to conifers. So was triclopyr. So the active ingredient in Garlon was also applied too. What we started seeing in our study, however, is that the effects of the early treatment, those effects on the tree community, persisted out to year 20, year 30. So basically when I went out and I did my work, the areas that were sprayed were conifer dominated. The areas that weren't sprayed were deciduous dominated. In this case, it was basically a mix of northern hardwoods, aspen, some birches thrown in there and stuff like that, but certainly not conifer dominated in the areas that weren't sprayed. Give you some sense.
And that would be the intended effect, right? Like that's an expected.
That's exactly, that is the expected effect. And we saw that many years later, it's still the case that we affected the tree community composition. But when we started looking into the understory below the tree community, what we started realizing is that, through the analysis, that basically the herbicided areas, we weren't seeing any effect really of herbicide application on variation that we were seeing in the ground flora. So there's so much.
What was that timeline again? Sorry, you said 20 years?
So this would have been at years, I think it was about 22, 23, and then 32, 33 after application. Okay. So it's kind of that 10-year time frame, mid-rotation after the herbicide application. But so, years, you could just say years 20 to 30. By that point, like of the total variation in the ground flora, very little of that was being explained by the herbicide application. So pretty much we weren't seeing any effects of the herbicide treatments out to that time.
So how surprised were both of you guys with both your studies to learn that? Because like I would have assumed, just not knowing anything about it, I would have assumed that there's going to be some kind of impact, right? So what was your guys' reaction when you learned this?
Me first?
Sure. Yeah, John. Yep. I keep forgetting that I have to tell you who should talk.
I actually came in, fairly open-minded. I wasn't expecting it to go either way. Mm-hmm. So, it was just more, like I got pulled into this very late and it was a big rush on it because they started this in the fall and we had to get out there and collect. Well, remember how we had to all stop what we were doing and run out and collect the data. And right at that point, I was just more focused on getting control of all that. And, you're just making sure that was all done correctly. And I wasn't really thinking about whether what the impacts would be at that point until after we got the data in and we started analyzing it. And really, I had no perception either way which way it would go.
So just go that's what it is.
Yeah.
Okay. Matt, what about you? Did you have any expectations?
Yeah. It definitely shattered my expectations because, so basically I already spent a whole bunch of time out at the Austin Pond study collecting tree data before we even did the ground flora stuff. So like, I'd spent a lot of time stomping around and just observing the ground flora, just, you spend time in the woods, you can't help but start making sense of pattern. And what I was noting, at least what I was seeing in my mind, was definitely lower cover, lower diversity in areas that had been sprayed but unthinned. So really dense conifer, trees are really duking it out, lots of standing dead trees and stuff like that, thousands of trees per hectare, that kind of scenario. We weren't seeing much coming, which wasn't too surprising, not much in the way of resource availability in the understory and all that kind of thing. But then when I was doing work in the areas that hadn't been sprayed at all, or even pre-commercially thinned, were just basically hardwood dominated, northern hardwoods, the ground floor to me just seemed really, really rich there. And this was, again, just personal observation kind of thing. So I was thinking, okay, well, if there's going to be any differences out here, I think it's going to be based on whether the area was sprayed or not, really. I thought that was going to be the big difference. And kind of to our surprise, it was actually, it was the areas that were pre-commercially thinned that actually had the highest richness, diversity, and cover. So irrespective of whether it was sprayed or not, it really had nothing to do with the herbicide application at that point on this particular study site. It was really about the pre-commercial thinning, just kind of opening things up, allowing more light into the forest understory, and just kind of the structural changes in the forest that resulted from that. We hypothesized that was the likely explanation as to why we were seeing those differences.
Right. Yeah, I wouldn't have expected that either. I would have thought that it would have some kind of lasting impact, right? So it's just, I guess you kind of assume the worst.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, exactly. And I guess, and I think some of it too is just like, again, my academic upbringing, you talk about northern hardwood forests in that part of the world, and everybody talks about how great the ground flora is, and which it is. I'm not knocking it or anything like that. But and just like, the number of spring ephemerals and all that kind of stuff. And like, certainly those plants were out there, but statistically, we weren't able to really distinguish between that and some of the other treatments, which again was pretty surprising to me.
It's kind of counter to what we would all expect. We would expect there to be some kind of difference. So I suppose people probably want to dive into why there wasn't a difference, right?
Yeah,
So John, you said that there was, you've attributed the difference to literally just the difference in forest cover, right?
That's correct.
So how could you be sure that was the case, or why were you comfortable you know what I mean, saying something like that?
Well, just to be realistic, we didn't have a super large sample size.
Okay.
So we, just to clarify on that.
For sure.
But there was no indication, even with that small sample size, that there was anything else going on than what we concluded.
Right. And you would expect there to be like just naturally speaking, if you walked into an aspen stand with a little bit of spruce and you walked into a spruce stand with a little bit of aspen, you would expect some differences from a natural succession standpoint. So, when you're comparing these two different stands, is it difficult to compare them because they're not really the same? You know what I mean?
Well, in the context of the understory, if I understand you correctly, yeah, they're easy to compare. Okay. In the overstory with the trees, I think you can still compare them at that level. It's just you're going to see differences in the tree species that are there.
Right.
Yeah, it's. I think it's important too that as I was learning about this after the study and talking to the people who are experts in glyphosate, one of the questions that I asked was, well, what happens with glyphosate in the soil? How does it degrade? And I got a lot of interesting responses. In short, it does not stay long in the soil. And so
what's long?
I think if I understand, Matt, you might want to speak to this better than me, but I think it's like within a few years, it's pretty much non-existent.
Right.
Matt, do you know the answer to that?
Well, I was looking up right before this, of course. I was like, oh man, I gotta cram a little bit on this.
None of us are toxicologists, right? So this is outside all of our realms of expertise for sure.
I haven't thought too much about the details of this, but like one thing with the glyphosate half-life isn't particularly long. So it's something like maybe a week or 2 weeks or something is the half-life of glyphosate. So it doesn't persist very long in the environment. It does tend to break down pretty quickly. And I think as it does break down, it tends to break down into forms that are not quite toxic, so it's basically break down into forms that really aren't that dangerous or anything like that I'm aware of. We don't need to talk about the toxicology, I guess, because that's like I did a whole episode on that with Ryan Prosser, right,
from the University of Guelph, talking about the toxicology and how it's not it's not a chemical that is supposed to be able to impact human beings because it doesn't have the right pathway or whatever. But again, I'm not a toxicologist, so I won't say that. I'll just quote what Ryan said. But because I guess that's always, we don't have to go down this route because again, none of us are toxicologists. But like that's kind of, I think, everyone's concern, right? Is that it causes cancer, and if they're eating blueberries that come from this stand, they could be getting carcinogenic effects and that kind of stuff. But anyways, when we look at the ecology of it and that kind of thing, like, do you guys feel comfortable as ecologists, as professionals? Do you feel comfortable saying that there's no like these are still natural stands, right? Like this is an ecologically healthy area, and there's no visible impacts on the ecological health of the area relative to the untreated areas, I should say.
Well, I think you got to be careful when you say natural, because in the context of forest management, everything, even the stuff we don't harvest is managed.
Yeah, we can go down a rabbit hole on that one.
So thank you. And I think
I use the word natural in the sense of the layperson who's listening wants to know if this cup block could be considered natural in all intents and purposes when you're comparing it to a non-anthropogenically disturbed area.
Absolutely. I mean, I think what you're trying to say is that the areas where we use glyphosate, is there anything significantly different about those that is not anywhere else?
Yeah.
So do these stands actually line up with something else that we would have naturally?
There you go. Yeah.
Yeah. And my speculation, of course, there's nothing, I have never seen anything to indicate otherwise. So
interesting.
Yeah. Same here.
Yeah, it's just interesting. I think people, even myself, I kind of want to look for impacts and like what is happening, right? So was there any, besides the mosses, which you guys attributed, John, to just the difference in forest cover type?
That's correct, yeah.
Was there any other unintended effects that maybe you did note that, may be a red flag or something that needs to be looked into further?
Well, I wouldn't say the moss was an unintended effect. Just
sure.
To me, it's a natural effect, just based on the on the crown closure and the species composition.
I suppose I mean because the intention of applying glyphosate is to temporarily affect whatever competition that may exist on the landscape for a short period of time, and to eventually allow that stand to get back to normal and not be impacted by it, right? So the intended effect is to get rid of, in the boreal, to get rid of aspen and hardwoods and some grasses so that conifers can grow. That's the intended effect, I guess.
Well, the way I understand it, the wording that I've heard and understand it is not necessarily to get rid of the aspen and the grasses as much as to give the conifer a chance.
Yes. I shouldn't say get rid, because it's not like they're gone forever. They don't.
They're
still there. They come back. It's just temporarily.
That's
to allow the conifer an opportunity to take root and succeed.
Yeah, to get established and to do some sort of level of performance.
Yeah, it's not like it's killing the root systems of these things or anything like that. But
so I can also say something about unintended effects in a sense with the Austin Pond study. Kind of an interesting discovery was that. And I guess it's not so much of a discovery when we think more about it and how formulations of herbicides, how they affect different species differently and that kind of thing. Selectivity, that whole concept. But like what we were finding is that the glyphosate seemed to be more selective against aspen than it was against maple. There was efficacy. There was reduction in maple abundance early on and that kind of thing. But it really seemed like the aspens were the ones that were most negatively affected by the glyphosate. But then when you looked at the areas that were treated with triclopyr, it was actually the opposite. We actually saw it was the maples that really seemed to get negatively impacted there, much more so than what we were seeing in the aspens. And it's interesting because these were some things that were noted early on in the study. And sure enough, 30 plus years after the application, we still see those effects in the forest composition itself. Now, is that entirely based on the effect of the herbicides? Was there inherent differences in the community composition of these different treatment units at the start of the experiment? Those are things that it would be hard to really say for sure. But it is the fact that we're seeing enough of a pattern out there. It does suggest that perhaps there are these differences in the selectivity that could kind of subtly push the composition just in the way that we saw in this study.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk about like what you guys actually measured as far as like biodiversity. Like what were the measures of biodiversity you used, and what are they and why? John, do you want to go
just from a biodiversity, we did a Shannon-Weiner index, and what was the other one? I can't remember the name of it now.
Prevalence analysis.
Yeah, and then alpha. We measured alpha diversity, beta diversity. And then we measured, we compared total percent cover, just like so. One of the interesting things we looked at was it was more of a biomass question. Is there an impact on the actual total vegetation cover overall?
Right.
And then we looked at the indicator species.
Indicator species. Okay, so what was the intention of using indicator species there? What's
the intention, as I was mentioning before, was that the indicator species these are species that we know are specific to certain edaphic conditions, so we call them site indicators.
Uh-huh.
And we felt that, and because our main question was, did herbicides affect the site in any way? We thought those were good areas to sort of focus on. So if we saw significant differences in indicator species, that may lead us to question, maybe there is some sort of impact going on in the soil that we aren't aware of.
Gotcha. And there was no, like that's something that's interesting. When you say no significant difference, right? Like there's no, or how did you word it? You said there was no statistical difference, or?
Yeah, we basically, we simplified everything and we just compared everything at a student T level. Now, and let me clarify too, with the indicator species analysis, there were, I think, 3 species that they did say there was significant differences.
Oh, really? Okay.
But when you compared the mean differences though in percent cover, we're only talking like, 5% differences in percent cover on average.
Oh, this is percent cover. So the amount of it on the ground, not necessarily the...
Yeah, I'm sorry. Everything was measured in percent cover.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. And then with the biodiversity measures, it's really about number of species.
Right. Biodiversity is number of species, not like the
number of different species.
And different species, right. Yeah. And then, but you guys were also measuring stuff like the evenness of that biodiversity. Like if, you know what I mean?
That's correct.
Because you could have 17 species on a landscape, but one species is 95% of the cover, then that's not a very even biodiversity, right? So you guys measured all of those types of things. It wasn't just like this is here. It was like how much of this is here, and is that comparable to the untreated kind of thing? Yeah,
right. And then with the beta comparison, it's more of an inference on sort of the community itself. So it kind of tells you, is the community significantly different from each other? So you might have a case where you have one plot you have 15 different species, and then the other plot you have 16 different species. But are they the same species?
Right. Because that matters as well, right?
That's correct. Yes.
Yeah.
So the beta sort of is an inference of that, and there was nothing significantly different with those as well.
So significantly different. How do you measure that?
It's a statistical. It's based on probability, a likelihood that basically that these are the same. These sites are the same or they're different. It depends how you set up the null hypothesis.
Right. Okay. Matt, how about you guys?
Yeah. So we looked at species richness, just the total numbers of species occurring within a quadrat. We also estimated the cover of each of the species that we had within the quadrats, so then we could determine evenness. And then we looked at some of the more complicated indices. We looked at Shannon-Weiner and then also the Simpson's index. So those, as far as the biodiversity aspect, those were the main indicators that we used. We also looked at just straight cover as well, just as a measure of abundance. And we broke that down by taxonomic groups. So like, cover of all the mosses together and cover of ferns and so on and so forth. And then we were able to kind of compare the various treatments using those covers of species groups.
So I want to know, like, between you guys, I kind of want you guys to talk a little bit, because I'm coming at this with no real education on the, you know what I mean, all this kind of stuff. It's been a while since I've been in university. I haven't done stats for a while and never did like it. So what questions should I be asking? If you were someone looking at these studies and you wanted to pick it apart and figure out where, like, if something went wrong or where you should be looking into, what questions would you guys be asking? Matt?
Yeah, I think John brought it up before. One of the things you really want to pay attention to is sample size. You want to make sure that areas were sampled intensively enough to really be able to say anything definitive about the data, right? If there's just a few plots out there, just kind of scattered in relatively large units or something like that, and they're making those kinds of comparisons, I certainly would be a little more skeptical of the results. That would be, certainly one thing. And when it comes to ground floor, and this was a little bit of a criticism with our work, is that we didn't repeat the sampling at various points within the growing season. So we may have missed some plants that say, based on their phenology, we may have missed a few plants at different points in the season just because we sampled at a time when they weren't really apparent. So if I was to, I would want to look at something like that as well, especially something that's focused on ground flora specifically. It depends on your forest type. In our forest type here, we don't have a lot of spring ephemerals, but up north and up in Maine and stuff like that, up in northern hardwoods, you have quite a few. So that would be something also to pay attention to, is just like more sampling design related stuff.
So, John, your study probably had the same issue,
we
right?
don't have that same issue because we have such a short growing season that, pretty much.
Got out there once.
Right.
They'll expand in numbers and stuff like that, but we don't have, I don't know of any anyway. We're a situation where maybe some orchids, but we don't have a lot of orchids, but
right.
Where you would get plants at different parts of the summer.
Right. So, but it could be a criticism of it, though, of this, is that maybe we should have been out there more or something. Who knows?
No, I don't think based on my experience out here, I've been out in the field a lot. I've never ever really noticed a real difference during the season, other than some of the earlier flora. They usually are the first ones also to die, or to turn color. And
that was my kind of thought, is because I think there was some sampling in like late August and that kind of thing, that maybe something like that.
Yeah, I tend to lean on Aurelia as the indicator when the plants are going to go, because it's usually one of the first ones to start. You can start seeing it turn color, and that was the whole impetus on this project when they came to us at the end of August, and they were thinking they were going to be out there sampling vegetation in October, and I was like, no, it's not going to be there.
so that was, out of curiosity, what Aurelia species is it? Sarsaparilla, wild sarsaparilla, or bristly?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, okay.
I think it's sarsaparilla.
Okay.
Yeah. So what kind of questions? Because like I said, I want you guys to go back and forth a little bit about how you guys would talk about this and what would be important, because I want to get a good feel for, I don't know what questions to ask, is the honest truth. I'm not a research scientist, right? So what other questions, as like a lay person, if they wanted to read these studies, what should they be asking themselves? Because we want people to be able to look at these studies and be able to assess it for themselves and kind of not just take our word for it, kind of thing, right?
Well, it's interesting because as I started growing with this project, and we had a couple meetings, and again, it was just me trying to understand what the heck was going on with this project. And one of the questions I asked was, well, what was life in forestry like before glyphosate? Like, what?
That's a good question.
What were you guys doing? And these are old guys, right, that have been around a long time. And they said, basically, we were not sustainable. We could not guarantee that when we harvested a stand that we could put it back to where it was, because we didn't have the tools to, and this is not extensive. This is not like everywhere in Alberta, but there's a big chunk of Alberta where they were not sustainable, and they basically felt that they didn't have the tools at hand to be able to ensure that.
Mm-hmm. And that changed with the advent of glyphosate.
Yeah, that's what they told me. Yeah. So this was like almost like a miracle tool for them, because and then back then too. I mean, I just remember when I was in university and stuff, sustainable development was a really hot topic, right?
Right. That's when the United Nations started talking about sustainable development.
Yeah. And so they were like, we are not. It's almost like, I guess in our context, they weren't meeting the standards set out by the government that they had to meet for their tenure.
Yeah, and that's the story I get from a lot of foresters, right, that are retired now and that kind of thing, is that things have only gotten better with time, and glyphosate was one of those things that allowed it to become more sustainable, right? Or I shouldn't say more sustainable, because it's either sustainable or it's not. It became sustainable all of a sudden, right? So, so Matt, what about you? What other things would you be, you know what I mean, trying to tell the layperson to look into, to be skeptical of, to think about?
Yeah. Of course, I got my wife, like, well, she's not quite here whispering in my ear, but like, I can just hear, I can hear in the back of my head telling me right now, like, that. So some things or at least one thing I think would be interesting to examine would be actually looking at life cycle aspects, kind of looking more at life history of some of these plants, because, we can say that the plants are out there, we can characterize their abundance, but really, like, reproductively, are we seeing them flowering? Are they producing fruit? Are they in a position where they're actually completing their life cycle?
So the health of those plants, not just the existence of them.
Exactly, because a lot of these plants, I mean, they can spread clonally, so they're spreading vegetatively, and they can persist for quite some time, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're sexually reproducing. So I think that would be an interesting kind of follow-up to look at some of those aspects as well. So not just focused on their presence, but their ability to complete their life cycle.
Yeah. No, that totally makes sense. I would think that there would be some value to comparing, like for example, in this study with John, what did you guys call this study? Was there a name that you called it? You just called it the FGROW study or something?
Yeah, I think it was just an FGROW biodiversity study.
Okay, so yeah. I was hoping you had like a catchy name. Like we called it
Austin
study or something. Like, I don't know. But so it was mostly talking about the untreated stands became aspen, so trembling aspen. The treated stands were white spruce, correct? Mm-hmm. There wasn't much for pine, I don't think.
There was some pine, yeah. There was some pine ones,
well.
yeah.
Okay.
There were some pine sites.
So some lodgepole pine.
Yeah.
Would there be value in comparing, say, the biodiversity or whatever? I'll just say the ecological indices of, say, a burnt area of similar composition, right? So like say like a 30-year-old burn that's mostly white spruce or mostly aspen, to these cut blocks.
I think that would be very valuable, actually. And I'm not, and again, I'm ignorant of what kind of studies are out there for after burns, but I think that if there is data, long-term data following burns, I think that would be incredibly valuable, because I think that's something that we can integrate into this, because I mean that by definition is the natural process.
And I don't want to step into too much like anecdotal stuff, but if you had to speculate, like if I had to speculate, I would say there would definitely be a difference between the cut block and the burn, because we know there is right now. If you just, you know what I mean, you go into a burn, it's going to come back differently than the cut block. Period. It has to do with the way we treat it, the way we harvest it, versus how much is left on the landscape. So if you had,
sorry, Matt.
Yeah, go ahead.
But then this is, and I have limited knowledge of fire ecology and stuff like that, but sure. I think there's also, it's not just the different intensity of the burns. There's yes. lots of different factors that of the burn itself that will dictate sort of what's going to happen after.
If you totally burn off the organic layer, then it's going to be very different. If there's mineral soil left, it's going to be very different than a cut block that still has the organic layer.
That's simple. And I think there are studies out there. I'm sure there are somewhere. I haven't seen them.
EMED has done some of that stuff.
I think so, yeah.
The EMED study, that's a big study for people that don't know that. If you're in Alberta and you're in forestry, you've heard about the EMED study repeatedly for the last 25 years. Yep. But what was that? What does EMED stand for again?
Emulating
ecological management, emulating natural disturbance. That's what it is. So I would assume that there would definitely be differences, but we would have to contextualize those differences into expected and unexpected, and why are those different, and is it something that makes sense, or is it something we need to look into further? But
I think it would be a very interesting question, personally.
Yeah.
Because I mean, that's really, I think everybody in the forest industry, that would be their end goal, is to try and emulate as much as possible.
Yeah.
What's going on naturally in the environment.
Yeah. And that's kind of the intention, right? So Matt, anything to add to that?
Yeah. And I'm happy you brought that up, because I've thought about this quite a bit. And I think also kind of just broadening the spectrum, if you will, of different management intensities as well. So I think even including, say, areas where, say, more ecological forest management is being applied, more of the emulation type silviculture is being applied, versus areas that are more intensively managed or more production-minded forestry, a lot of times where you're spraying herbicide and doing things like that and pre-commercially thinning, but then also having natural disturbance examples to throw into that as well to kind of broaden that spectrum, if you will, or that continuum of extremes in terms of the management intensity.
That's always my issue, is that I am so focused in Alberta that I forget that like most of the states is privately owned land. Like it's privately owned forest practices, right? Like it's not a lot of like national or state forests that are being managed. It's a lot of private stuff. And I forget the difference in that, and that like I'm always talking about being like emulating natural, but like, yeah, there is a lot of like even in Europe, right? Like it's a lot of heavy, you know what I mean, heavily managed stuff just because they don't have as much available. So yeah, I always forget to compare those differences.
Yeah, and just even take the extreme, you could look into the southeastern United States where they have some really intensive forest management practices happening there, you know, with site preparation methods, bedding and planting genetically improved nursery grown stock and all that kind of stuff. It's extremely intensive in some cases down there. And I know that that's something that a lot of folks down there are studying, you know, impacts of forest management, things like that they try to broaden that range of management activities as much as they can by trying to bring in to kind of compare against the intensive management, some, you know, more extensive forms of management as well, just to kind of give more context.
Right, for sure. So again, as ecologists, getting back onto like the use of glyphosate in forestry, and with these studies, right, where you've determined there's no statistical difference long term, on the, what would you say, on the biodiversity or the ecology of the, how would you word that?
Well,
I don't want to word it incorrectly. I don't want to misquote.
Me?
Yeah, sure, John. Yeah. Again, keep forgetting I have to tell you who to talk.
to me, the biodiversity is really what we're looking at is the actual site conditions.
Sure.
So the biodiversity is like really, because it's the site that drives all the vegetation, and yes, climate and stuff like that, of course. But it really here in Alberta, I mean, the parent material, the slope, all that kind of stuff is a huge driver of what vegetation you're going to get. So really, my focus on that was really just about, did it impact that whatsoever? So was the site inhibited or enough that it's preventing it to actually support the vegetation, the natural vegetation that would be there?
Right. Okay.
Something like that.
Would there be a more intensive way to go about studying to get more answers around that? Because if you're saying what you're really trying to study is not necessarily the biodiversity per se, but the soil values and how it's been impacted, right? Because that's gonna. Is there a different way to measure that, or maybe a more
we talked about earlier, we could directly go in and do soil analysis.
Right.
Absolutely.
There's value in that.
Oh yeah, we could do a whole range of chemical analysis and stuff like that on the actual, and really nail down what.
So I know that's been done in the short term with glyphosate. There's a lot of those studies, but in the long term, I don't know if there is.
Well, the problem with that is we have to account for sort of micro sort of variances in the soil and stuff like that, for sure. And we'd have to take a step back and sort of broaden what we would analyze in the soil. But I'm pretty confident that if the flora species aren't that much different, then really nothing's really that much different with the soil.
Right. That makes sense.
Yeah. So,
what about do you guys know, this is totally stepping outside, but like you guys said, if you're ecologists, you're bringing the puzzle together, right? What about, do you guys know of any like impacts on like invertebrates and that kind of stuff?
That's a good question. No, that was not part of yeah.
It's a different thing, right? I guess like I know there's probably studies again of the short term, but the long term, I feel like invertebrates or just animal and insect biodiversity.
I'm pretty sure the EMEN project looked at something about that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I have no idea.
Yeah. I think there was some sort of component of insects in there.
I know they do a lot of insect stuff on the EMEN, but I'm not sure if it has to do with glyphosate. I think it's just with harvesting and different harvesting methods and that kind of thing.
Yeah. Because the real focus of EMEN was mimicking forest fires.
Yeah. It wasn't a glyphosate thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I guess I'm just trying to get a more comprehensive picture of what else should be done because we want to continue to question, right? We want to continue to figure this out, and like science doesn't end at like one study, right? Like it has to be repeated and continued in order to solidify the hypothesis and make sure that we've done all that we can, right? So I guess I'm just trying to expand on that and where it should go from here.
Yeah, like I can speak a little bit to some other work that's been done. So like the Cooperative Forestry Research Unit out of the University of Maine, they're the ones that originally got the Austin Pond study going. They've done a whole bunch of stuff looking at intensive forest management, and particularly from the perspective of different wildlife species, wildlife habitat values and things like that, and how those species are reacting to the management on the landscape. I actually want to say the Austin Pond study may have been included in some of that work.
Okay.
So, if you're affecting the forest composition and the structure through the management, that clearly is having habitat impacts. And that's going to, in some cases, it's going to be detrimental to some species, but it's going to be beneficial to others and stuff. We just kind of shift the cast, if you will, a little bit by making these alterations to the habitat. And I think that's one of the main things that's come out of a lot of that research, at least based out of the CFRU. I think also some of the larger spray, programs and stuff that came in the wake of the spruce budworm back in the 70s and the 80s, that basically created habitat that actually wound up having some beneficial effects for snowshoe hare, there's been some interesting connections that have been made between the effects of management on the landscape and what that means for wildlife habitat and stuff. But I completely agree. I think kind of thinking about the other consequences and not just focusing just on the flora. Of course, that's what I tend to focus on because I'm a vegetation guy and plants don't run away from me when you go to measure them. But like,
no scratch either.
Yeah. Sometimes get a little poison ivy, but that's all right. But yeah, so like, and of course that creates basically the basis for everything else. So I think we can make inferences about what that means for wildlife just by looking at the vegetation. It's such a good integrator. But I think other studies focusing a little bit more on higher taxonomic levels and higher trophic levels and stuff like that, I think are also of value.
What about even like further down the line? Like when was Austin Pond, when was like your study completed? So my phase of the project. My phase of the project was gotta think back to this, summer of 2011. I think it spilled a little bit into 2012. 10 years now. Right. So is there interest in going back 10 years later or 20 years later or 30 years later? Because when we talk about forest management, we talk about, again, the 200-year time horizon, right? So is there talk about continuing to repeat these studies and see how it goes?
That's a really good question. I mean, last I heard that they had gone out and they had done basically overlaid a new set of treatments out to the Austin Pond study, looking at kind of alternative futures for northern forests. So they did a whole bunch of really interesting stuff, but kind of working with the original study, trying to retrofit it as best they could. Right. So my understanding is that they are continuing that work. So I'm not sure it's with the same plot design or anything, but I would imagine that they are looking at vegetation, not just the trees, but also looking at ground flora.
Mm-hmm. And John, with what you're involved with and the people you're talking to and stuff, do you know if there's interest in continuing to do more of this in the future?
I hope so. I mean, I'm not
right now. You're just trying to get this one out.
Yeah, absolutely. If somebody came to me 10 years from now and asked me to do this again, I would completely say yes. Yeah. I'll be a lot older, but, and moving slower, but.
So what would you do differently? In 10 years from now? You've learned a lot. I've seen you got a few extra gray hairs.
Yeah.
You lost a few extra.
I'm not sure. I'd have to think about that one. I think I would. I mean, really, right now, I wish somebody, and I'm not the big driver in this, of course, but I wish somebody would start another one, right, and then start putting more plots in the day. I think what would be really important going forward is that we get more data, and I'd also like to, look at comparisons with just mechanical, right, site prep and stuff, and see what the long-term impacts of mechanical site prep is on biodiversity and stuff like that.
Because that's something that I know. Well, this conversation will go hand in hand with the one I had with Milo Mihalovic back. I think I released at the end of December last year, and we were talking about public perceptions of glyphosate and, managing for values and making sure that all values are protected for a long time. And this one would go hand in hand with that one, in that was more very talking about the personal and the people and people's involvement with nature. This is more talking about the ecology, the actual health of the landscape in relation to glyphosate and that kind of thing. And I think, trying to get all these together is kind of the key, right? And so,
I honestly don't think it would be very difficult because, it was very similar to the project that you were talking to me about way back. So, there's still lots of cup blocks here in Alberta that have been herbicided and that are part of the study.
Right.
We could fairly quickly locate those, and any ones that has a residual stand inside. So that's basically what the cup block would have been.
So basically, something
that's what the cup block would have been had it not been harvested.
Yeah.
We can look at we can compare the flora, and then we can actually see, okay, is this cup block actually moving towards what it was supposed to be if we didn't harvest?
That's a good
point.
Right.
And I think, and I don't think that would be really expensive. The long-term studies are great, but we could actually put in a lot of plots right now and just look at the comparisons.
Right. That makes sense. And just for people that are aware, I know people know what residual means, but basically if people aren't aware, when you harvest the cup block, you leave a lot of called residual patches in the middle of the cup block and throughout for wildlife corridors and nesting and all that kind of stuff. And so John's talking about putting plots in there, saying that that's what the stand would have looked like had it not been harvested, and comparing that to the cup block and seeing the trajectory. And that totally makes sense. Because the whole idea is we want to be, you can get into the big meta question of what is sustainable, right? What do we mean by sustainable? Because and does sustainable just mean natural, quote unquote, right? Mm-hmm. The word that is forever scrutinized by ecologists and environmentalists alike. And what do we mean by that? Or do we want something that's more intensively managed in the sense that we can the way Milo says it, we can nudge things in a way that we want them to go, because we are heavily involved in the forest, right? It's not a quote unquote natural system the way we think about it, was just without human involvement or whatever, right? Or without, I should say, colonial involvement, if you want to go that route. And so we have to ask ourselves that question of what do we want, right? And what is sustainable? Because we have the power to do that.
And I think I think most people know that, we are having an impact on the environment. We can't help it. And it's just as in areas that are closer to humans it's more of an impact on that environment as opposed to areas that are not. And I think it's really the question is what's a negative impact and what's a positive impact? And I think as foresters, we are always trying to have a positive impact.
Right.
It's always the mentality that we want to have a positive impact on the environment. We want to consider all these things, biodiversity. We want to consider habitat, because foresters, I think, are just as big users of the forest as anybody else. So, and have as much respect for the forest as anybody else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I would agree. Well, and they live and work it all the time, right? Same with, yourselves, ecologists and that kind of stuff. These people are always in the bush, always doing something with it, whether it's playing or working or whatever. And they're the ones who are going to see these differences over time. And I kind of got off track here, I guess.
Well, no, but it also goes back to one of your first questions is why do people get into this business?
It's true. Yeah.
It's because they like being outdoors and they like being in the forest. And so I think those people would have, if they enjoy the forest, they're going to have a lot of respect for the forest.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. What do you guys, this is outside the realm of our conversation a little bit, but what do you guys think, what do you guys think the public perception is? Why do you think they have such a negative reaction in general, if I was to average it out to the use of something like glyphosate? Matt?
Yeah. Well, certainly just seeing what's going on in the news, just being made aware of potential carcinogenic effects of things.
Yeah.
The fact that it's being applied to our food, that certainly gets people very concerned about these things. Mm-hmm. Just to speak more from a forest perspective, in applications of herbicides in forests, I think a lot of the kind of the negative perception of that kind of goes back to the view of a forest as being kind of a natural thing. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of people go by a forest and kind of think, oh, that's nature in its natural state, and it's, largely unaffected by humans, not really realizing that some of these areas were probably cleared, 80 to 100 years ago, and have had livestock kind of moving through, they've certainly been impacted in some cases for centuries by humans, but they just kind of have this appearance of being natural. So kind of the thought of applying chemicals that we've created to the woods to affect the vegetation, to kind of redirect, the forest itself into something that's more, quote unquote, usable to humans. I think that there's often just a negative perception associated with that specifically. I think it's just kind of this perception of, yeah, exactly. Just that the forest is kind of more natural than
why
other
do we
systems.
Think we know better than Mother Nature?
Exactly. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's an interesting one. That's a really interesting one. And to that point, I often point out that like indigenous people across the world have been managing forests for their values for time immemorial, right? Since long before colonialism was a thing and Western society was a thing, they've been managing the forest. And it's so the concept of natural, I think, can't be separated from the use by humans, right? Because we're part of that ecology. We just feel we're separated from it now because we can build metal walls and burn dinosaur bones to transport ourselves around the world. But it's kind of a big step that I'm jumping there. But it's just, it all comes into play, right? When you start to talk the philosophical use of all these types of things and where we want to go with it. So from your guys' perspective, we'll get back to the more direct kind of questions about the glyphosate and the ecology of it. After all of this, what are kind of your takeaways after you got all these studies? And I mean, Matt, it's been 11 years or 10 years since you've finished yours. How do you guys feel about glyphosate used in forestry? John?
Well, based on the study that we did and based on what I'm told, I have no issues with it whatsoever.
Do you
like I said, coming into this study earlier, I was indifferent. I was like, I really didn't know a lot about glyphosate. I wasn't bothered either way, whether we use it or not.
Yeah.
But after being part of the study and actually learning about more of the applications of glyphosate and sort of what the world was like here before glyphosate, I'm like, yeah, I think, I don't think, based on what I'm told, I don't think there's going to be areas of the province where we won't be able to manage properly.
Without it. Yeah, it's true. It's an interesting point for sure. Matt, how do you feel about it?
Yeah, I totally agree with John in that sense. I mean, I've seen more positive than negative from my perspective, and I've read more positive impact than negative impact associated with it. Mm-hmm. I also like to think because the science itself, as far as the application and the operational aspects of it, has come along so much that the folks that are applying this are really very very qualified when it comes to applying pesticides and stuff like that. In some cases, having to go through rigorous, processes to be able to get certified. So those are the folks that are applying it, and they are very professional about it. And in some cases, they're trying to put out just the amount of chemical that they're going to need to have the desired effect. Yet that they don't want to go above and beyond that, right? They're really just trying to keep the rates at whatever the minimum efficiency point is.
Yeah, that was something that Milo said once. Was that there was an assumption he was out in the bush and he was in that podcast that we recorded with him a while back, but he said something about someone, an environmentalist or an environmental professional that he was with had said, well, if you spray herbicide in a cup block, it's going to be everywhere in that cup block. And he said, well, maybe if you do it, right? The point is that it's not like it's being willy-nilly sprayed at 300 feet above the canopy, and it's just kind of drifting down and getting in the water and getting everywhere. It's like, no, they're doing this right at tree level or sometimes below with the helicopter and just doing exactly, or even by hand sometimes, doing exactly the spots that they want to do. And you can see examples of that. If you fly over the boreal forest, you can see cup blocks that have almost checkerboard patterns of where they sprayed and, you know what I mean, for research purposes and that kind of thing. And they're really, really good at doing it. So it's not like there's no concern of it being all over the place, right? If conditions dictate, if the conditions aren't right for it, then they're not going to do it. They'll wait until conditions are right for it.
they're very deliberate with their application.
I remember when I was a student working up north for a mill, and we went out one day. They were gonna allow us to be part of like the spray, right? And so we were up at like 3:30 in the morning, and we were out in the bush by 5:30. And it was like 4:30, I think, by the time we got out there. Still really early. Like the sun was just kind of peeking out. And we get there because they're trying to get there before the wind, before the sun comes up, before things start to change. And there was no breeze. There was no wind at all. Like I could have sworn there was nothing there. And they're like, no, go home. We're not doing it today. It's too much wind. And I'm like, what do you mean? I can't feel anything. He's like, it's like a 5 kilometer an hour wind. It's way too much. And I'm like, 5 kilometer an hour wind? Like, when is there less than that? And it's like, yeah, they're very, very, very careful about what they do. And it's my concern is always, I think, what do we lose if we stop using tools like this, right? What is lost ecologically speaking, sustainably speaking? And I'm not sure if you guys feel comfortable speaking to that, but if you do, feel free. John, anything to say?
Yeah, I think I tend to think at the landscape level a lot, and I think that's something that we need to consider, especially within sort of a forest management context. I think I always like to think that everybody's sort of doing the right thing. I just assume
people want to do the right thing.
People want to do the right thing, and I think one of the advantages of forest management and silviculture is potentially, if we can increase the crop rotation. Because Matt, you probably know our crop rotation here, especially with conifer. It's pretty long. We're like looking at 100 years.
Yeah.
And there's some evidence too with just this tree studies that we're shortening that rotation. And if they're able to shorten that rotation and still supply the mill and still supply the economy with that wood on a smaller land base, then potentially we could free up the more land base for other things, right?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, just something I'm just throwing out there.
No, it's an interesting point for sure.
Yeah.
It's not one I've thought about, but you're right. It's an interesting point, right? I guess that's the ultimate goal is to protect the land base for as long as possible and protect all values for as long as possible. Then yeah, if you can provide that economic benefit while also sustaining all the values you want on the land, then that's a great thing, right? Why wouldn't it be?
I think so, yeah. And I think everybody, as long as I guess the mills aren't going to take the more wood and try and pump out more timber. I think
that would be the argument, right? Is that they would just amp up their cut or whatever, right?
That's right. Yeah. But I think that's where the government can come in, right? And the government has controls over, it's crown land, right?
You can trust the government.
Well, I know, but this is where the responsibility of the government comes in, right?
Yeah,
I mean, it's crown land. The government has full control about what really goes on the land because it's everybody's land. It's not the forest company's land.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's just something where that would have to come into play with the government.
Yeah, I'm happy you brought that up, John, because that was exactly what I was thinking as well, is just that, if we're able to intensify on smaller acreage, if we can basically produce the same amount of timber on a smaller acreage, then that can free up some other areas for other uses.
While also maintaining that same ecological function on those areas. With increased growth.
Exactly. Yeah. And yet we can do that and yet also address some of the contemporary issues that we're dealing with now with climate change and maybe trying to use some of our forests in a more of a mitigation strategy in certain places and protecting biodiversity in others where we passively manage. We don't do any active management. We just allow nature to kind of dominate that kind of thing. But it's by using things like herbicides that do help to shorten rotations and intensify yet not, totally negatively impact the ecosystem. That it's through doing that we can achieve these multiple objectives at a larger scale that I think are going to become increasingly important as our population continues to grow.
Yeah, I agree. And I just had a thought. I don't know why I just thought of this, but just from a climate change perspective, I guess you could look at forestry as actually climate positive because we're taking all that carbon and locking it up in houses.
Right.
And then planting more trees.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it is. And that's one of the arguments that's made a lot, right? Is it?
Yeah, I just thought of it. I was just like, I didn't really thought
it is an argument that's made a lot, although the rate of bad burns that we have in the boreal now, by bad, I mean massive, mega fires that aren't supposed to happen as frequently as they're happening now. Apparently the boreal forest is now carbon positive, supposedly, but I guess I've lost my place. I don't know what the hell we were talking about anymore. But yeah,
we're going a little off topic. But.
Yeah, but I guess ultimately, I guess the argument that's made by silviculturists is that when you take glyphosate, the use of glyphosate off the landscape, you're going to drastically decrease the amount of conifer land base that exists on the landscape for X period of years, right? And that's going to have a trickle-down effect affecting habitat, affecting species, affecting biodiversity, affecting everything. And the idea is if we're going to cut, we need to be able to grow back. And so we have to have a tool to make sure that those conifer land bases come back. And so this is one way. I don't know if it's the ultimate way. I don't know if we have to use it. I don't know if we I feel pretty comfortable in it the same way you guys do. I feel like it's being done carefully with a lot of research. It's being done sustainably. It's being done within scope, and I feel comfortable with it. I hope that the use of it doesn't get forestry kicked off the land base permanently. Because there's examples of that happening as well. I know, Matt, you probably know of like the whole everything that happened in Maine the last few decades or whatever. I remember, there was some issues there, and it's just I hope that whatever happens in the future, that it's whatever it is, it's for the better of sustainability.
Yeah. Matt, am I allowed to ask you a question?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, sure.
Oh, sorry.
Not this one.
No, actually, no, both of you, actually. No, sorry.
Okay. Too many Matts.
Both of you. Yeah, so I guess I'm always curious, okay, what would happen if, say, tomorrow they said we're not allowed to harvest trees anymore, forestry is done, or even like 2 months from now?
Sure.
Or look at it from a context if we didn't have forestry or a forest industry.
Right.
What would that be like?
That's a good question. If we didn't have, so you're saying if we didn't have a forest industry starting
look
now
at
or ever?
Say it all ended. Say
it all ended now.
Say everybody said, yeah, no, we can't do forestry anymore. And it's not all over. And you could put it in the Manitoba or the Alberta context, and then Matt, you could put it in the U.S.
I mean,
context.
from the ecological standpoint, the economical standpoint, obviously, a bunch of jobs, a bunch of livelihoods, and then all of a sudden we have no building material. The thing I always say is that forestry, sustainable forest management, is the only truly sustainable resource, raw material that we have on the planet, that I know of. Maybe there's more, I don't know. But without it, we're forced to use brick or metal or maybe bamboo or hemp or something to like build homes. And we know that those end up being like either just resource extractions with no sustainability effort, or it's a agricultural method that requires a lot of inputs and isn't sustainable in that way. And so you end up having no wood. So you have nothing to store carbon. So you have nothing to wipe your ass with. You know what I mean? The old adage, wipe your ass with an owl or something. I'm
assuming that's going to get edited.
You want to go real crazy, but all of a sudden we're, as a society, incredibly damaging to the environment, in that all we're doing is mining and extracting and not giving back in any way. We would have, in my mind, it would be terrible. Not just from an economic perspective, but from a societal perspective, from a global perspective. Like, what do we depend on now? Right? Like, we can be very proud of the forest industry in that it's done a sustainable job, and we can extract things from the planet and give back at the same time, and it equals out so that there is no net negative or positive. It just kind of stays the same. Whereas without forestry, I don't see any replacement for that, any sustainable replacement for that. So I think to be blunt, we're kind of fucked. That's my perspective anyways. Matt?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And the other thing, you kind of think of some of the other consequences of something like that. Well, we're actually seeing some of that playing out in other parts of the U.S. Like, I mean, just look out in California, for example. We're having mega fires, and certainly climate change is culpable for part of that. But a lot of it, too, is the fact that you have areas that have gone unmanaged for a very long period of time, and where fire has been actively excluded. And and of course, California is kind of the extreme case of it, but we see this all over in the U.S. Like, just where I live here in New Jersey, there's very little active forest management in our woods aside from prescribed burning. and it's done very strategically for wildfire mitigation and that kind of thing.
It's hazard reduction. Yeah.
But what you're seeing really is just a forest that's just overstocked. Trees are unhealthy. We're seeing southern pine beetle now with climate change. Now they're not getting the low winter temperatures to knock down their population. So now they're really starting to expand here where historically they really haven't. So we're seeing a lot of this kind of stuff going on. And a lot of it is as a result of not managing the woods. And the fact is we have already affected natural process to the point now where I don't think we ethically can just step away and just let nature do its thing. Like I think we actually need to take an active hand.
I think you're right.
I think we're kind of past that point. I think it's on us.
Absolutely.
To intervene.
I think you're absolutely right. That's a perfect point, right? We're heavily involved to the point that to step away would cause significantly more damage, to the point that we would lose a lot more than than the potential of us doing an active, thoughtful, comprehensive management strategy, which allows us to maybe protect or even bring back some things, right? So it's an interesting question to ask for sure. And especially in the context of the fire, right? So like if we stopped doing forestry, but we continued to suppress fire, that only further increases the amount of fuel on the land base, only further increases the likelihood of large...
There's a threshold there that, you're going to get something that's you've never ever seen before.
Yeah.
And it's happened.
Right.
Yeah. It's happened in a certain context. Yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting question for sure. So like ultimately I feel like if I want to get real crazy with it, I feel like we absolutely, like humanity as a species, needs sustainable forest management in order to survive into the future. If you want to get real crazy about it, right? Because like it really, you start to go down a rabbit hole of, you know what I mean? Loss of sustainability, loss of ecology, loss of carbon sink, and everything starts to fall apart, right? Like it's a delicate balance that we've somehow managed to strike. Unfortunately, climate change has kind of run away, but I think it would only get worse, right? So yeah, it's a good question.
Yeah.
Maybe we should end it on that.
Yeah, my head hurts.
I don't think we're going to top that. Yeah, we're getting out there. So, any kind of, anything you guys want to finish with? Any leaving statements?
No, I think I'm good.
Yeah. Matt?
Yeah. Same here. I just want to say thanks for the opportunity. I really enjoyed this discussion. Good just interacting with you guys.
Yeah,
you as well, Matt. I appreciate it.
It's good to meet you and good to talk to you. And yeah, I've got to be honest. When I recording this episode, I was more nervous than most episodes I record, because this is it could have been a very analytical thing, and we could have gone very scientific with it. And I'm not super comfortable with that, which is why I do the podcast, because I like people to explain things to me.
Yeah.
But so I was glad that we were able to navigate it in a way that I think makes sense and can point out the importance of what these studies discovered, right? So this is really, really good. I liked it. And yeah, I think as far as the study that John's been involved with, if people, like I said, I'll have the links in the show notes there for the field tour guide. People can go out to these sites and see them for themselves. There's a bunch of resources it's on the FGRO site, correct? Yeah,
it's on the FGRO site somewhere. Yeah, I'm not sure exactly where it is.
I'll link to that so people want to look into it, and I'll also link these studies somehow or another. And this is a cool conversation. I hope we can continue to be critical of like herbicide use, and continue to expand our knowledge and expand the way we use it, and continue to be as sustainable as possible. So yeah, this is a good conversation, guys. Thanks so much. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you guys learned something. I know I learned a bunch. And if you want to learn more about it, if you want to be skeptical, you want to look into these papers yourself, look into some of the information, I absolutely encourage you to check out the Forest Research Institute website, Forest Herbicide Information landing page. That contains a number of papers, links to other sites and studies, information on how to take that self-guided tour, the field tour guide that I was talking about. Those are the sites that John Nash discussed today. And there's links. I'm going to link all these papers, all three papers, the Lautenschlager Sullivan, the Austin Pond, and this new one into the show notes. I'm also going to link this webpage and a bunch of other stuff. So if you want more, you can look there and look elsewhere as well. the more voices, the more opinions, the better. We want to suss this out, and we want people to be comfortable. So check that out. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope you come back. I look forward to having more cool conversations like this. And thanks again to Matt and to John. So yeah, thanks a lot, everyone. Take care. We'll catch you next time.